The black Zenith everyone overlooked at auction, until I saw what was inside. The auctioneer's voice cracked on the last syllable of the opening bid, and nobody moved. I noticed that. In a room full of creatures who had spent their entire lives buying and selling things worth more than whole planets, not a single one of them raised a finger, a tentacle, or a bid panel. 300 alien salvagers stood completely still, and the silence in that hangar bay was the loudest thing I had heard in years. My name is Sarah Mace, former deep salvage commander for the United Nations Space Corps, current freelance junk hunter, and the only human being within 6 light-years of Cathara Station. I was standing in the back row of the auction floor with a cracked visor, a flask of cheap synth whiskey in my coat pocket, and exactly 412 credits to my name. I had come to Cathara because a contact named Gil Farrow had told me there was a decommissioned Dreth mining hauler going up for cheap, and I needed a ship that could actually carry cargo without venting atmosphere every 3rd day. Gil Farrow was wrong. The Dreth hauler had sold in the first hour for 900,000, snatched up by a Veilcore merchant clan who outbid everyone so fast the auctioneer barely had time to finish his sentence. I had watched that happen from my spot by the back wall, taking a slow pull from my flask and doing the math on how long I could keep paying for my docking bay before I would be sleeping in it. Cathara Station itself was not the kind of place that inspired confidence. It orbited a dead white star at the edge of the Veilcore Confederacy's border territories, which meant it was just far enough from anything important to attract the sort of people who preferred not to be found. The station smelled like recycled air and old machinery, and the lighting in the main auction hall was the particular shade of yellow that made everyone look slightly unwell. The floor was packed with Veilcore in their layered merchant robes, Dreth representatives in their gray body armor, a cluster of HFY science collectors near the front, with their scanning equipment already humming, and a handful of independent operators like me scattered along the walls. The first 40 lots had gone fast. Ship hulks, salvaged cargo containers, partial engine cores, 2 intact Veilcore frigates that started a bidding war so intense I thought someone was going to throw something. Everything sold. Everything had a buyer lined up before the auctioneer even finished describing it. These people knew what they wanted, and they had the money to get it. Then the auctioneer called lot 117, and the room changed. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in posture. The Dreth representative near the front lowered his bid panel. The HFY chief in the second row turned to his colleague and said something I could not hear. 2 of the Veilcore merchants on my left took a single step back from the display screen, so small a movement that I almost missed it. But I had spent years reading rooms in zero-gravity environments where every gesture had to count for something, and I noticed all of it. The display screen showed a ship. It was not an impressive ship, at first glance. It was not large by salvage auction standards. It was roughly the size of a heavy cruiser, maybe a touch longer, with a hull shape that reminded me of nothing I had ever cataloged in 12 years of deep salvage work. The lines were too clean for Dreth engineering, too angular for Veilcore design, and nothing like HFY construction at all. It had a long central spine with 2 broad wings that swept back at a low angle, and everything about its silhouette suggested something built for speed and endurance, rather than bulk cargo or heavy bombardment. But the color was what stopped me. The hull was black. Not painted black, not coated in any absorption treatment I recognized. Black in a way that my eyes kept sliding away from, like looking at a hole in the air, rather than a physical object. The display screen showed it from 4 angles, and in every single one of them, the ship looked less like a vessel and more like an absence. A shape cut out of the star field behind it. The auctioneer described it as Lot 117, origin unknown, manufacturer unregistered, salvaged adrift 12 weeks ago near the outer meridian by a Veilcore recovery team. No active power signature at time of recovery. No crew, no manifest, no registry signal of any kind. He opened bidding at 50,000 credits. No one moved. I looked around the room carefully. The Dreth representative had not just lowered his bid panel. He had turned away from the display screen entirely, and he was speaking quietly into a comm device clipped to his collar. The HFY chief had run a scan with one of his handheld devices. He looked at the readout, then he put the device in his bag, picked up his equipment case, and walked out of the auction hall without a word to anyone. His entire team followed him, single file, quiet as funeral procession. The Veilcore merchants closest to the front shifted their weight again. One of them said something to his partner in the clipped dialect used for private conversation, and I caught two words my translator rendered as "old mark" and "do not." The auctioneer lowered the opening bid to 20,000. Silence. He lowered it again to 5,000, which was an embarrassment. You did not drop a starting bid 3 times in the same minute unless you were desperate to move the lot and equally desperate not to keep it. I pulled out my flask, took a slow pull, and thought about what I was seeing. Every experienced buyer in this room was refusing to bid on an uncatalogued ship of unknown origin. That was not normal caution. The HFY collector had scanned it and left. That was not normal caution either. That was a specific reaction to a specific piece of information. The Dreth representative was on a comm call. The Veilcore merchants were actively avoiding looking at the display screen. These were people who bought derelict warships for sport. They were people who purchased salvaged alien technology without knowing how to turn it on. They were people who had, earlier in this same auction, enthusiastically bid on a Veilcore frigate that the auctioneer had openly described as navigation systems non-functional, weapons status uncertain. None of them had blinked. But this ship was making them back away from the screen, which meant one of two things. Either this ship was genuinely dangerous in a way that every experienced buyer in the room recognized immediately, or this ship was valuable in a way that every experienced buyer in the room was too frightened to pursue. Either way, the information gap between what they knew and what I knew was the only advantage I was ever going to have in a room like this, and I had spent my entire career doing exactly one thing with information gaps. I stepped forward and raised my hand. The auctioneer looked at me the way you look at someone who has just told you they intend to jump off a very tall bridge. Not with anger, with a kind of exhausted professional sympathy. 400 credits, I said. The room went so quiet I could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. The auctioneer looked at his board. He looked at the room. Not one bid panel moved. Not one hand went up. He looked back at me with the expression of a man who has just realized he is about to do something he is going to regret forever, and he said, "Lot 117, sold." The Dreth representative on his comm call turned to look at me as I moved toward the payment counter. He did not say anything. He just looked at me the way you look at someone who has picked up a live power cable and is still standing, for reasons that physics has not yet caught up to explain. I paid my 400 credits, signed the transfer documents, and collected the docking code for Bay 97. The clerk at the payment counter was a young Veilcore male with gray-green skin and the kind of expression that junior station staff develop when they are too polite to say what they are actually thinking. He processed my paperwork without comment. Then, just before I walked away, he said something in Veilcore that my translator caught as, "Human, be careful with the black one." I asked him why. He shook his head and looked back at his screen and did not answer. Bay 97 was in the lower tier of Cathara's docking ring, the section reserved for large salvage lots and vessels awaiting transfer. The corridor leading to it was wide enough for cargo movers and mostly empty at this hour. My footsteps echoed. The lighting down here was even worse than the auction hall, a deep amber that made the walls look like old bone. I heard Bay 97 before I saw it. Not a sound exactly. More like a pressure change, a very slight shift in the air the way you feel it when you step into a room that has been sealed for a long time. The kind of stillness that is not empty, but waiting. The bay doors were standard Cathara industrial, 3 meters tall, and controlled by a simple panel on the wall. I keyed in the docking code from my transfer receipt, and the doors slid open. I stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the ship. It was larger than the display screens had suggested. The auction photos had given it a sense of proportion that was slightly misleading, the way wide-angle images always flatten depth. In person, in this bay, with the amber lighting of the corridor behind me, and the ship itself directly ahead, it was genuinely large. Its hull absorbed the bay lighting completely. There were no reflections, no highlights, no visual texture. Every other ship I had ever stood next to had some kind of surface quality, some sheen or grain, or mark of manufacture. This one had nothing. It was simply dark, in a way that made the surrounding bay feel brighter by contrast. I walked slowly around its exterior, keeping a distance of about 4 meters, running my hand scanner along the hull without touching it. The scanner gave me nothing useful. No alloy match in any database. Hull temperature consistent with ambient bay air, which meant the ship had been sitting here long enough to equalize, maybe several days since transfer from the recovery team. No active emissions. No power signature. No manufacturer's mark anywhere on the exterior. No hull number. No registry plate. Nothing. I stopped at the forward section where the main boarding hatch should have been, based on the hull shape, and found it. It was a simple recessed panel. No visible controls. No keypad. The seam of the hatch was so precisely cut that it was almost invisible to the eye. I ran my finger along the edge and found the seam only because of the very faint temperature differential at the gap. I pressed my palm flat against the panel beside the hatch. There was a pause of about 3 seconds, which felt much longer. Then the hatch slid open. I had not done anything deliberate. I had not entered a code or spoken a command. I had pressed my hand against an unmarked panel on a ship of unknown origin that had been sitting dead in salvage for at minimum several months, and it had opened. I stood in the hatch doorway and looked into the interior of the ship and felt, for the first time in a very long time, something I had almost forgotten how to recognize. I felt curious, not cautious, not worried. Not any of the sensible things that a person with any instinct for self-preservation should feel when standing at the entrance to an unknown alien vessel that had just opened itself up without being asked. Just curious. I stepped inside. The corridor beyond the hatch was dark for exactly 2 seconds. Then a low, warm light activated along the floor edges, running ahead of me in both directions, like the ship was showing me the way. The light was a deep amber, not entirely unlike the Cathara corridor behind me, which was either a remarkable coincidence or something else entirely. The ceiling was high, much higher than it needed to be for the exterior dimensions I had surveyed. That was the first thing that caught me wrong-footed. The interior felt bigger than it should. The corridor walls were smooth and dark, the same light-absorbing material as the hull exterior. There were no visible panels or controls along the walls, no standard interfaces, no signage in any language. The air inside was clean and slightly cool, and it carried a very faint smell that I could not immediately identify. Old machinery, yes, but something else underneath it. Something that reminded me of the smell of old paper, or a sealed room opened after a very long time. I moved deeper into the ship. The floor lighting continued to activate ahead of me and dim behind me as I walked, which was either automated environmental response or something paying attention to where I was going. The corridor curved gently to the right and opened into a broader passage, and the ceiling height increased again. I was starting to feel like the proportions of this ship's interior had been designed around a being that was, on average, roughly 20 to 30% taller than I was. Everything was just slightly too large. The doorways were too wide. The ceiling was too high. The corridor was built for something with a longer stride. At the center of the ship I found the command bay. It was a large circular space with a raised central platform and a ring of stations arranged around the exterior walls. 12 stations in total, each with a chair that was too tall for me and control surfaces that swept up at an angle designed for arms longer than mine. The forward wall was a single curved surface that I immediately recognized as a viewport, although it was dark and opaque from the inside. The ceiling of the command bay was domed, and it was covered in a material that looked like it might, under power, display an exterior view of space around the ship. I stood in the center of the command platform and turned slowly, looking at every station. The room had been empty for a long time. I could feel it, not physically, not through any instrument, just the accumulated stillness of a space that had not had movement in it for years, possibly much longer, possibly decades. Then something happened that made every hair on my body stand up. A sound came from the ship's core. Not a loud sound, not an alarm or a warning tone or anything dramatic, just a very low, very quiet hum, like a single note played on an instrument too large to see, coming from somewhere beneath the command bay floor. The sound lasted about 4 seconds, then it stopped. Then a voice spoke. It did not come from any visible speaker. It came from the air itself, or from the walls, or from everywhere at once in a way that made the direction of it impossible to determine. It was not loud. It was the kind of voice that did not need volume to reach you, the way a very quiet person in a completely still room can somehow be heard across the entire space. It spoke in a language I did not recognize, not Veilcore, not Dreth, not any of the 8 contact languages in my translator's database. But as I stood there and the sounds washed over me, something strange happened in the back of my mind, like the edge of a word in a language you studied once as a child and then forgot, coming back to you not as a clear memory but as a shape, a feeling, a half-formed meaning, just below the surface of conscious understanding. I caught fragments, 3 of them, over the course of about 20 seconds of speech. The first was something that meant, or at least felt like it meant, recognition. The second was something that translated, loosely and imprecisely, to waiting. The third was a name. The voice said, with perfect clarity, and in a way that crossed completely through my translator without any effort at all, 1 word: Ozymandias. Then the hum stopped. The voice stopped. The command bay went back to its quiet, waiting stillness. I stood on the command platform of a ship I had purchased for 400 credits from an auction where every experienced buyer in the sector had refused to bid, and I breathed very carefully in and out, and I told myself the same thing I always told myself at moments like this. Figure out what you have first. Panic later. I pulled out my hand scanner again and began taking readings of every surface in the command bay, slow and systematic. The scanner still gave me no alloy match, but it was starting to pick up something it had not registered before. A power signature, faint but consistent, coming from below the floor. Not zero, not dead. Residual, like coals that have been banked for a very long time, holding heat with extraordinary patience, waiting for someone to put new fuel on them. I sat down in the central chair on the command platform, which was too tall for me, and forced me to sit forward on the edge of it. I looked at the dark viewport ahead of me. I looked at the 12 empty stations around the room. I looked at the dome above me, dark and waiting. I thought about the Yehesi collector who had scanned this ship and walked out without a word. I thought about the Dreth representative whispering into his comm. I thought about the Veilcore clerk who had told me to be careful with the Black One and then refused to say anything more. I thought about the voice that had come from the air itself and said a name like it had been waiting for a very long time to say it to someone. And I thought about the fact that I had pressed my hand against a panel and the ship had simply opened, without a code, without a command, without anything except my hand. I opened my flask, took 1 more pull of synth whiskey, and closed it again. "All right," I said to the empty room. "I'm listening." Nothing answered. Not yet. But somewhere below the floor, very quietly, the hum started again. And this time, it did not stop. I did not sleep that first night on the ship. I told myself it was because I needed to keep taking readings, which was true, but the more honest reason was that sitting in that command chair, with the low amber light running along the floor and the quiet hum beneath my feet, I did not feel the particular kind of alone that usually makes sleep difficult. I felt like I was being watched, but not in a threatening way. The way a house watches you when you first move in, patient, waiting to see what you do next. I spent the first 6 hours mapping every compartment I could access. The ship had 4 main deck levels connected by 2 lift shafts, both of which were non-functional, so I used the emergency access ladders that ran parallel to each shaft. The upper level contained the command bay and what I identified as officer quarters, 8 rooms each, with sleeping surfaces built for someone taller than me. The second level was crew quarters, more numerous and more compact, with sleeping surfaces for perhaps 40 people. The third level was engineering and maintenance, with large open bays full of equipment I could not identify. The fourth level, the lowest, was accessible by ladder, but only to a point. 3 of its sections were sealed behind doors that did not respond to any input I tried, including my palm, which had worked on the entry hatch without difficulty. I noted the sealed sections and moved on. You do not force doors on unfamiliar ships. You learn the ship first, and the doors open themselves when they are ready, or they do not, and either way you do not force them. By the time the station's external lighting shifted to signal the local equivalent of morning, I had cataloged everything accessible and filled 2 data cards with readings, none of which matched anything in any database I owned. I went back to the command bay, sat in the oversized chair, and started cross-referencing against the public salvage registries I could access through Cathara's station network. The Veilcore Registry. Nothing. The Dreth Central Archive. Nothing. The joint Yehesi Veilcore Heritage Database, which catalogued every known vessel class going back 400 years. Nothing. The private independent salvager network that Gil Farrow had sold me access to 3 years ago, and which contained records from over 60 different species and trading organizations. Nothing. I was not surprised. I had suspected from the moment I stepped inside that this ship was not going to appear in any catalog I had access to, because if it appeared in any catalog that accessible, someone at that auction would have known what it was. The Yehesi collector certainly would have known, and he had done his scan and walked out, rather than stand in the same room with it. I kept searching. I expanded from ship registries to general historical records, Veilcore colonial histories, Dreth expansion archives, old trade route documentation. I was looking for anything that matched the hull silhouette, the light-absorbing material, the interior proportions. I was looking for a species that built for beings roughly 30% taller than humans, who used the name Ozymandias, who manufactured ships out of an alloy that no current database could identify. I found, after 4 hours of searching through increasingly obscure historical records, one single reference. It was in a personal journal entry by a Veilcore merchant named Kel Vasara, written approximately 400 years ago, digitized from an original physical document and archived in the Veilcore colonial records as a minor historical artifact of no particular significance. The entry was about a trading voyage to a system called Vel Prime, which at that time had been one of the busiest commercial hubs in the Confederacy's outer territories. Kel Vasara wrote, "We watched the black ship arrive at Vel Prime. The ones who built it were gone by then, but the ship itself, it was waiting. Waiting for something. We did not stay to see what." That was the entirety of the reference. I read it 3 times. Then I flagged it, copied it to my personal archive, and sat back in the oversized chair with my eyes closed. Gone. The ones who built it were gone. By the time this merchant saw the ship 400 years ago, its builders had already disappeared, which meant the ship was at minimum 400 years old. Probably older, since the merchant had used a phrasing that implied the builders had been gone for some time before that moment, not that they had recently vanished. I did the math slowly. If the builders had been gone for, say, 50 to 100 years before Kel Vasara's journal entry, then this ship's origin was somewhere between 450 and 500 years in the past. 500 years ago. A civilization building ships out of materials that no current database could catalog, with an interior built for beings of a specific size, which had left a vessel in known space that subsequently drifted unclaimed for centuries, until it ended up on a salvage auction on Cathara Station where nobody would touch it. A civilization that was gone before any current galactic power had apparently gotten around to writing much down about them. I opened my eyes and looked at the ceiling of the command bay. "Ozymandias," I said to the room. The hum beneath the floor shifted slightly. Not a response exactly, more like a change in attention, the way someone in another room stirs when they hear their name through a wall. "I know you can hear me," I said, "or something can. I have no idea what you are, whether you are an AI system, a ship intelligence, or something I don't have a category for yet. But you said a name, you said Ozymandias, and whatever you are, you opened the hatch for me when I put my hand on the panel, which means you either recognize my authorization to be here, or you identify something about me specifically. I'd like to know which one it is, and I'd like to know what happened to the people who built this ship." Silence for about 10 seconds. Then the hum changed again, and this time, it was not a change in attention. It was something building, gradually, like a power system warming up from a very long rest. The floor lighting along the edges brightened slightly. One of the stations along the outer wall of the command bay produced a faint illumination at its surface. Nothing readable, just light, like a screen powering on for the first time after years of dark. And then the voice came back. It was clearer this time. Still in the unknown language, still not matching anything in my translator database, but the fragments were stronger, more numerous, closer to the surface of meaning. I could feel them, the way you feel music, in a language you don't speak, where the emotional content comes through, even when the words don't. It was trying to speak to me, reaching across whatever gap existed between its language and mine, searching for purchase, for common ground, for a way to be understood. This went on for several minutes. I sat completely still and let it happen, not interrupting, not trying to redirect it. In deep salvage work, you learn very quickly that the worst thing you can do when a system is trying to initialize is interrupt the process. You let it work. You wait. Then something shifted, and 3 words arrived in my mind with the clarity of a sound heard in a perfectly quiet room. Not through my translator, not through any external speaker, directly, as if the words had been placed very gently behind my eyes by something that had finally found the right door. "A keeper," it said. "You came." I took a breath. "I came," I said. "I bought your ship at auction. Do you know how long you've been drifting?" A pause. Then, "Long." 340 years, I said, guessing based on the age of the journal entry and adding reasonable margin. "Give or take." Another pause. Longer this time. The hum beneath the floor deepened, and then something entirely unexpected happened. The dome above the command bay, which had been dark since I entered, activated. Not with a display of space outside, because we were inside a station bay, and there was no open space to show. It activated with data, lines of text and symbols in the same unknown script I had seen nowhere but in this ship, scrolling slowly across the dome's surface in dim amber, like a system that had been asleep for centuries and was now, painstakingly, rebooting itself. "Power is low," the voice said, "but rising. You are here." "I am here," I agreed. "You are one of them," it said. And then, with an emphasis I felt rather than heard, "You are one of the compact." I opened my mouth to say that I had no idea what the compact was, and then I stopped. Because from somewhere in the depths of my own memory, in a place so far back it felt less like memory and more like instinct, the word arrived not as a foreign term but as something familiar, something I should have known, something that felt, against all logic and reason, like a word I had been waiting all my life to hear used correctly. "Compact. Tell me," I said carefully, "what you mean by that." The dome above me continued to scroll with amber symbols. The hum beneath the floor deepened further. Power was rising, slowly and steadily, from somewhere in the ship's lower sections. The sealed doors on the 4th level were still sealed, but I had a feeling, clear and specific, that they would not remain so much longer. "The Ardent Compact," the voice said. "Your people. The ones who built me. The ones who are gone. My people." I sat in a chair too tall for me, on a ship that was 4 or 5 centuries old, in a docking bay on the wrong end of the galaxy, with 412 credits when I arrived, and 12 of them left after the auction, and I tried to process what it meant that an ancient alien vessel was telling me that its builders were human. Not alien. Not some civilization I had no connection to. Human. My people. "They left you here," I said. "On purpose." "Yes," the voice said. And then, with a weight that made the word feel like the last line of a very long story, waiting. The station outside the ship continued its ordinary business, commerce and noise, and the small human and alien dramas of a trading post at the edge of known space. Inside the command bay of the Black Zenith, the dome above me slowly filled with amber light, and the ship that had been sleeping for 340 years continued, carefully and with great patience, to wake up. I did not reach for my flask. I did not check the time. I sat in the oversized chair and listened, and for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The power readings on my hand scanner climbed steadily upward, not fast, but they climbed. And the name on the dome, the name written in amber in a script that was not Veilcore or Dreth or Yehesi or any language in any database I owned, resolved itself in the part of my mind that was already, somehow, learning the edges of its meaning. Ozymandias. I had asked what I had bought for 400 credits, an old ship, dark and quiet, that no one else would touch. But sitting there in that command bay with the dome alive above me, and the hum of something ancient and patient rising through the floor, I was beginning to understand that I had not bought a ship at all. I had found something that had been left here deliberately and carefully, by people who had known exactly what they were doing, people who had chosen, for reasons I did not yet understand, to leave this behind and trust that eventually someone would come. Someone human. Someone who, like all humans throughout every era of their history, would see a door that every sensible person was walking away from and think, but what is on the other side? I pressed my palm flat on the arm of the command chair and felt the ship respond, a subtle warmth, almost imperceptible, that was nothing like the cold metal of a dead hull. "All right," I said for the second time in as many hours. This time, something answered. The third day was when the sealed doors opened. I was in the engineering bay on the third level, running my scanner over a power relay system I could not identify, when the sound came from below me, not the continuous hum of the ship's slowly waking systems, which by now had become a kind of background constant I had stopped consciously noticing. A different sound, a single, definitive click, like a lock releasing. I climbed down the access ladder to the fourth level and walked the corridor to the first sealed door. It was open. Not standing open. Not broken. Simply unlocked, the seam visible now where it had been invisible before. The door ready to move at a push. I put my hand against it, and it slid aside smoothly, silently, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, and had been keeping itself in perfect operating condition, just so it could make this moment feel effortless. The room beyond was not what I had expected, though I had not been sure what to expect. It was an archive. The room ran the entire length of the fourth level's forward section, which was much longer than I had realized from the outside dimensions of the ship. Another instance of the interior feeling larger than it should. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with storage units that I recognized, after a long moment of staring, as data repositories. Physical data repositories. Not the crystalline type used by Veilcore, not the magnetic lattice type used by Dreth. A type I had never encountered in the field but had seen in historical records of early Earth-era deep archive storage. A format so dense it was capable of holding extraordinary volumes of information in a very small physical space. Thousands of them. Every wall, floor to ceiling, on both sides of the room, the full length of the archive. Thousands of individual storage units, each one roughly the size of my closed fist, packed side by side in organized rows, with a precision that told me this had been arranged by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, and had done it deliberately and carefully. In the center of the room was a single reading terminal, not powered, but intact. I connected my portable power cell to the access port, and after a moment the terminal activated, and the interface that appeared was, unmistakably, in a form of English. Old English, archaic in its grammar and usage, full of terms and phrasing that had shifted over the centuries between whenever this was written and the present day, but English, unambiguously, irrefutably, the language of Earth, my language. I stood at that terminal and breathed very slowly for a moment, and then I read what was on the screen. The first document in the archive's index was a message. A single document, pinned to the top of every other record in the system, labeled in a way the terminal's translation matrix rendered for me as, "For whoever comes after, we hope human. Read this first." I read it. It took 47 minutes to read in full. I read it once and then read it again, more slowly. The hum from the ship's core continued beneath my feet, steady and patient, and Ozymandias did not interrupt while I read, which I appreciated more than I could have said. The message was from the last admiral of the Ardent Compact. Her name, as the terminal rendered it, was Eleanor Voss. She had written this document 512 years ago, in the final months of the Compact's existence. She had written it knowing, with complete certainty, that the civilization she led was about to disappear from the galaxy's records. She had written it so that someone, eventually, would understand why. The Ardent Compact had been humanity's first real interstellar civilization. Not the first steps into space, not the first colonies, but the first true expansion. 140 years of growth that had taken humanity from a single solar system to a present spanning 63 star systems at its peak, with a population, a government, a culture, and a military that had made the other established powers of the galaxy take notice in ways they had not expected to, and were not entirely comfortable with. The compact had not been aggressive. Eleanor Voss was very clear about this, and from the records she cited within the document, the clarity was not self-serving revisionism. The compact had expanded carefully, had established diplomatic relationships with 4 major galactic civilizations, including the Veilcore Confederacy, and had spent a substantial portion of its resources on conflict resolution rather than military buildup. It had, in the language of the era, tried to be a good neighbor. But it had also grown, and the older civilizations of the galaxy, who had existed for centuries or millennia before humanity took its first steps beyond its own solar system, had watched that growth with an anxiety that had been building quietly for decades. The intelligence services of the Ardent Compact had discovered, 512 years ago, that 4 of the galaxy's major powers, including the Veilcore Confederacy, had reached a secret agreement. The agreement was simple in concept and appalling in detail. They were going to remove the human problem before it became the human reality that their models suggested it would eventually become. Not a war, exactly. A coordinated, comprehensive, simultaneous action against every compact installation, every colony, every vessel, every presence in known space. An extinction-level event executed with the precision of people who had spent years planning it and the resources of civilizations old enough to do it cleanly. The compact had found out, with enough advance warning to make a choice. Eleanor Voss had gathered the compact's full leadership council. They had run every scenario. They were, she wrote with a calm that 500 years later still transmitted clearly through the archaic language, entirely capable of defending themselves. More than capable. The military modeling showed that a coordinated defense, even a coordinated counteraction, would result in compact survival and significant damage to the attacking forces. Not a comfortable fight, but a winnable one. The question was not whether they could win. The question was what winning would cost. Not to the compact, to the galaxy. Eleanor Voss wrote, "We could win this war. We are quite certain of it. We are also certain of what winning this war would mean. It would mean fighting 4 established civilizations simultaneously, in a conflict spanning dozens of star systems. It would mean civilian casualties among species who had no part in this agreement, who did not vote for it, who perhaps did not even know it existed. It would mean a generation of destruction that would reshape this part of the galaxy in ways we cannot fully predict and cannot in good conscience choose. We have talked about this for 31 days without pause, and the conclusion we have reached is one that none of us expected to reach, and that all of us, when we were honest with ourselves, recognized as the only one we could live with. They chose to withdraw. Not to fight, not to flee exactly, but to step back, to collapse the compact's interstellar presence deliberately and completely, to recall every colony, every vessel, every citizen, to a single system, to destroy their own interstellar records and infrastructure, to become, from the outside, a civilization that had simply ceased to exist, to become small again, and quiet, and to wait. The plan had a name. Eleanor Voss called it the patient strategy. The logic was elegant and painful in equal measure. The attacking coalition needed a justification for their action, even a secret one, and that justification was the threat of a growing human presence in the galaxy. Remove the presence, and the justification removed itself. The coalition had no reason to pursue a humanity that had gone home and stopped expanding. There was nothing to fear from a species confined to a single system that posed no visible challenge to anyone. The compact would survive, diminished, hidden, watching. And one day, the galaxy would forget what humans had been. The fear would fade. The old records would be buried deep enough that the current powers would stop maintaining their guard. And then, when enough time had passed, humanity would remember itself, would find these records, would understand what had happened and why, would make its own choices about what to do next. Eleanor Voss ended her message with words that I read 3 times and still had difficulty absorbing. We are not asking you to be us. We are not asking you to rebuild what we were. We are asking only that you know we existed, that we chose, and that the choice was made with full understanding of what it meant and full acceptance of what it cost. We did not fall. We stepped back. There is a difference that matters deeply to us, even now, even in this moment. We were the ardent compact, and we were human. And we were, in the end, exactly as human as the species that came from Earth always has been. We chose the harder thing because it was right. Whatever you do with what you find here, do it knowing that it might help. I closed the message after the third reading and stood in the archive room for a long time. The compact's records were all here. Everything. The art, the science, the music, the personal logs of 140 years of civilization. Medical knowledge, engineering blueprints, diplomatic correspondence. The full account of every treaty they had negotiated, every conflict they had resolved, every decision their leadership council had made, and the reasoning behind each one. The complete record of a humanity that had reached the stars and learned, the hard way, what it meant to exist in a galaxy that was afraid of them. And one warship, one flagship, built to standards that the current galactic powers could not match even 5 centuries later, left adrift near the outer meridian with its AI in deep standby, waiting for a human hand on its entry panel, waiting for someone to come home. I pressed my palm to the terminal surface and felt the ship's quiet attention around me, and I said to Ozymandias, very quietly, "I understand why they were afraid. You know that, don't you?" The voice, when it came, was clearer than it had ever been. 3 days of slow power restoration had given it back something approaching its full range. "I know," Ozymandias said. "They had reason. We were extraordinary. We knew it. They knew it. That was always going to be the problem. And now?" A pause. "Now you are here, and I am awake, and the galaxy has had 500 years to forget what it was afraid of. And has it?" The lights in the archive room brightened slightly. Every storage unit on every wall produced a faint amber glow, as if the records themselves were responding to the question. "No," Ozymandias said. "It has not, but it pretends to. There is a difference, and you are about to discover it." I did not know, in that moment, what was about to happen. I did not know about the Veilcore War Council, or the Dreth High Marshal, or the signal that the Black Zenith was already, without my instruction, broadcasting on frequencies that every major naval power in the sector could hear. I knew only that I had 412 credits when I arrived at Cathara, that I had 12 left, and that I was standing in the archive of a lost human civilization in a ship that had been waiting half a millennium for exactly this. My scanner in my pocket showed power levels at 47%, and climbing. I thought about the Veilcore clerk who had told me to be careful. I thought about the Yehesi collector who had run a scan and walked out without a word. I put my hand flat on the terminal surface, and I said, "Show me everything." The amber glow on the storage walls intensified. Outside the ship, somewhere in the communications network of Cathara Station, something that had been dormant for 500 years sent its first signal in 340 years. And in the Veilcore Confederacy's sector command, 7 light hours away, a flag officer looked at an incoming signal trace on her board and went completely still. Because the signal carried a registry code. A registry code that every naval officer in the Confederacy was trained to recognize. A registry code that was listed in their strategic archives under a file marked Historical Contingency, Do Not Discard, that had been passed from admiral to admiral for 2 centuries without anyone fully believing they would ever see it used. The Black Zenith, active, moving. The flag officer looked at her communications officer for exactly 3 seconds. Then she reached for her direct line to the conclave of peers and said 4 words, in a voice that was completely steady and completely terrified. "It has come back." The first call came through while I was still in the archive room, reading the 3rd volume of Eleanor Voss's strategic notes on galactic diplomacy. My personal comm unit buzzed against my hip, which surprised me because I was deep inside a ship with hull materials that were supposed to be opaque to standard communication frequencies. Apparently the Black Zenith had different ideas about what my comm unit was and was not allowed to receive, because the signal came through with perfect clarity. I did not recognize the channel. The identifier code was Veilcore military format, high tier, the kind that senior officers used when they did not want their communications logged in standard records. I answered it. The face on my comm screen was a Veilcore female, gray-green skin, silver-gray rank markings along the side of her neck, large dark eyes that were currently performing the specific expression of someone who has prepared a great deal for this moment, and is discovering that preparation does not make it less unsettling. She was in a command environment. I could see the edge of a command station behind her, crew members moving in the background. She said, in Veil Corps, which my translator caught cleanly, I am Admiral Seth Kara, of the Veil Corps Confederacy 7th Fleet. I am addressing the current occupant of the vessel with transponder code designation Black Zenith. Please confirm your identity and your compact officer status. I looked at her for a moment. My name is Sarah Mace, I said. I'm a former deep salvage commander with the UNSC. I bought this ship at auction 3 days ago at Cathara Station. I am not a compact officer. I don't think there is such a thing anymore. A pause. She blinked twice. You bought it. For 400 credits. Nobody else wanted to bid. Another pause. Longer. She spoke briefly off-screen to someone I could not see, and I heard the response. 2 words in rapid Veil Corps that my translator rendered as, confirmed human. She looked back at me with the expression of someone recalculating several important things simultaneously. You are on the Black Zenith, she said, as if this required confirmation. I am. You are human. I am. And you say you are not a compact officer. I am saying exactly that, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, under the protocols of the Veil Corps Confederacy's Historical Contingency Accords, the activation of the Black Zenith's transponder constitutes a formal communication from the Ardent Compact. The Confederacy is required to acknowledge and respond to this communication. The nature of the current response depends on the status and intentions of the individual aboard the vessel. I need to ask you directly, what are your intentions? I thought about Eleanor Voss's message. I thought about 500 years of patient waiting. I thought about the archive room full of records and the sealed lower decks, and the power levels climbing steadily toward full capacity. Right now, I said, my intention is to finish reading an archive that is going to take me several more days. After that, I'll have better information, and I'll be in a better position to answer questions about long-term intentions. Seth Kara looked at me with an expression I could not fully interpret. Then she said something that I had not expected. The Conclave of Peers is in emergency session. The current matter before the Conclave involves a border dispute between the Veil Corps Confederacy and the Dreth Empire that has reached a critical threshold. The session has been in progress for 12 days. A resolution has not been reached. The activation of the Black Zenith's transponder has created an additional complication. What kind of complication? The Dreth High Marshal left the conclave chamber when the transponder signal was reported. The Veil Corps Prime Speaker suspended the session. Every military delegate in the room has been attempting to contact their home commands for instruction. I stared at her. Because of a transponder signal from an old ship that just woke up. Because of the Black Zenith's transponder signal. Yes. She looked at me steadily. You understand what that code means to every military command in this sector. I'm beginning to, I said. Tell me what I'm missing. She took a breath. The Ardent Compact was the only civilization in recorded galactic history that the 4 major powers simultaneously agreed was beyond their individual capacity to challenge. The Compact's diplomatic division resolved 3 wars between established powers. The Compact's engineering division produced technology that we have spent 2 centuries attempting to reverse engineer without success. The Compact's military division was never, in the entire history of the Compact's existence, tested in a full engagement, because no coalition was ever willing to discover what that engagement would look like. She paused. The Compact stepped back 500 years ago, and the assumption, the universal assumption of every military command in this sector, was that when the Black Zenith reappeared, it would not be alone, that whatever came next would be, whatever the form of it, a compact action. I absorbed this. You think I'm the advance signal. We do not know what you are, she said, but you are on the Black Zenith, and the Black Zenith is active, and that is, by any measure of historical precedent, sufficient to change the situation. I thought about this for a moment. I thought about a junk hunter, with 12 credits, sitting in an archive room reading 500-year-old strategic notes. Admiral, I said carefully, I want to be honest with you, because I think the situation calls for it. I am one person. I found this ship at an auction where nobody else would bid on it, because everyone else in that room knew something I did not. I have spent 3 days reading the ship's records and talking to its AI system. I do not have a fleet behind me. I am not an advanced signal for anything. I am a former salvage officer who asked a lot of questions and got a lot of answers that have significantly expanded my understanding of the galaxy I live in. She waited. But, I continued, I am on the Black Zenith, and apparently that means something. And if it means something to the Conclave, and the Conclave is in the middle of an emergency session about a war that is about to kill a very large number of people, then I think I would like to attend that session. Sethkara looked at me for a long moment. You understand what you are asking. I am asking for a seat in a room where important decisions are being made, on the basis that the ship I am on apparently gives me standing to be in that room. Is that wrong? It is not wrong, she said. The Compact's charter, which predates every current treaty in this sector, and which no galactic power has ever formally renounced, because doing so would require acknowledging certain historical facts they prefer to leave unexamined, grants the commanding officer of the Black Zenith standing as a diplomatic envoy at any formal council of galactic powers. Then I would like to attend. She looked off screen, and then back at me. I will escort the Black Zenith to Conclave coordinates. Remain aboard the vessel. Do not transmit anything further until we arrive. Understood, I said. One question. Yes? Is the Dreth High Marshal still in the building? She blinked. Yes. He did not actually leave the facility. He stepped outside the chamber. Good, I said. Make sure he knows I'm coming. There was a silence, and then Admiral Sethkara said something in rapid Veilcore that my translator caught as, "Ancestors grant patience," which was apparently the Veilcore equivalent of, "That is not how this works," but she said it quietly, as if she knew that pointing out how things worked was going to be less useful than simply accepting what was happening. Her image closed. My comm unit went dark. I put it in my pocket and looked at the ceiling of the archive room, and then at the walls full of records, and then at the terminal that still showed Eleanor Voss's message on its screen. You heard that, I said to Ozymandias. I did, the ship said. What do you think? A pause. I think Eleanor Voss would have said something very similar if she had been in your position. She would have done it better. She had more preparation. You have something she would have valued equally. What's that? Honesty, the ship said. She was very good at many things. But she always said that the most powerful opening in any negotiation was simply telling the truth about what you were and what you wanted, because most people in most rooms were so accustomed to the performance of diplomacy that plain truth landed like a thunderclap. I pulled my flask out, looked at it, and then put it back without opening it. All right, I said. Let's go find this war council. The Black Zenith's drive systems, which had been at 30% capacity when I first heard them, had climbed to 62% by the time I reached the command bay. The dome above the central platform was fully active now, showing not amber text but a complete exterior view, the inside of Cathara's docking bay, in full visible light resolution. Better imaging than anything I had ever seen on any ship I had previously operated. The mooring clamps released when I sat in the command chair, without my touching any control. Ozymandias did it, reading the situation and acting. The bay doors at the end of the docking ring began to open ahead of us. Outside was the starfield at the edge of the Veilcore Confederacy's territory, and somewhere out there, 7 Veilcore warships were forming up to escort a single vessel of unknown allegiance to a war council that had never expected to see it. I sat in the command chair that was too tall for me, and watched the stars appear as the bay doors opened wide. I was a junk hunter with 12 credits and no plan who had accidentally inherited the diplomatic legacy of a civilization that had been deliberately forgotten by the galaxy for 500 years. I thought, well, this is certainly something. The Black Zenith moved forward into open space, and behind it, the docking bay of Cathara Station sat empty, and the auction hall where nobody had wanted to bid on Lot 117 continued its ordinary business, entirely unaware that the lot's new owner was currently being escorted by 7 warships to a war council that was about to become considerably more complicated. The conclave of peers held its sessions aboard a vessel called the Speaking Ground, a massive joint operation platform that no single galactic power owned outright, maintained collectively by the 4 major civilizations as the one piece of neutral infrastructure that everyone had agreed, over several centuries of difficult negotiation, to keep neutral. It was enormous, as diplomatic installations tend to be, built to communicate through sheer scale the seriousness of whatever took place inside it. I saw it from the Black Zenith's command dome before we docked. 7 Veilcore warships in formation around a single dark vessel, approaching a structure the size of a small moon, ringed with docking arms and signal arrays, and the running lights of 100 vessels already moored along its exterior. It was impressive in the way that very expensive things built by committee tend to be impressive. Large, organized, and somehow cold despite all its complexity. We were given a docking arm on the outer ring. Ozymandias brought us in without my guidance, and I made no effort to take manual control because it was obvious from watching the ship maneuver that Ozymandias was far better at this than I would ever be. I watched the arm approach on the dome display and thought about what I was about to walk into. I knew the basic shape of it from what Admiral Seth Kara had told me. A border dispute between the Veilcore and the Dreth that had been building for 18 months, now at the point where the military commands of both sides had concluded that the next provocation, however small, would trigger a full-scale engagement. The conclave session had been convened 12 days ago, in a last attempt to find a resolution. It had not found one. 12 days of conversation had produced nothing, except a list of everything both sides refused to agree to. I had read, in Eleanor Voss's strategic notes, her account of 3 similar situations that the compact had helped resolve. The methods were not complicated in principle, though they required a great deal of patience in practice. You identified what each party actually needed, as distinct from what they said they wanted. You found the space between the genuine needs where agreement was possible. You stayed in the room until you found it, and you did not allow either party to leave until you did, because people who leave a room stop negotiating and start preparing for the alternative. The notes were clear, practical, and written by someone who had done this successfully multiple times. They were also written for people who had the authority of the compact behind them, which I did not, precisely, have. What I had was the Black Zenith, and apparently that was, in this context, close enough. Admiral Seth Kara met me at the docking arm in person. She was taller than I had expected from the comm screen, and the rank markings along her neck were more numerous than I had registered at first, which meant she was more senior than she had implied in her initial communication. She looked at me with the careful, measuring expression of a professional who has spent a career assessing situations quickly and is currently working very hard to process one that does not fit her existing categories. "You are exactly as presented," she said. "I am," I agreed. "What were you expecting?" "I was not certain," she said. "The last compact officer I have any record of was documented in historical archives 490 years ago. The documentation suggests a level of presence that I was not entirely sure a single individual with no advance preparation could project." "I have no interest in projecting anything," I said. "I have interest in finding out whether the people in that room want a war or just believe they have no other option. Those are 2 very different problems." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Come." The corridor from the docking arm to the conclave chamber was long and wide, and lined with the kind of deliberate, impersonal decor that says this space belongs to no single culture, and therefore to everyone, which in practice means it belongs to no one, and feels like it. Crew members and diplomatic staff from multiple species moved through it with the purposeful efficiency of people who knew they were being watched and wanted to look appropriately serious. I walked with Seth Kara, and I noticed the way people moved as we passed. Not away from Seth Kara, who was a senior flag officer and would ordinarily command a certain amount of deferential space. The clearing happened ahead of me, specifically, which meant that word had moved faster than we had. They knew who I was. Or rather, they knew what ship I had arrived on, and that was enough. The conclave chamber was exactly what a room designed for civilizations to negotiate in should look like, and therefore managed to look like nothing at all. Round table, 12 seats, neutral color scheme, perfect acoustic isolation. At the table were 9 delegates when I walked in. The Veilcore Prime Speaker, 5 additional Veilcore diplomatic staff, and 3 Dreth military attachés. The Dreth High Marshal's chair was empty. I noted the empty chair. I sat down in the seat that Seth Kara indicated. The 9 people at the table looked at me. I looked back at them. "I'd like the High Marshal to come back," I said. "I understand he stepped out. Would someone ask him to return?" Now, the Veilcore Prime speaker, a tall elder male with silver markings indicating a very long career, and the specific expression of someone who has been at this table for 12 straight days without resolution and has reached the end of his patience with the process, said, "The High Marshal expressed reluctance to continue the session in its current form." "What form would he prefer?" "He did not specify." "Then he probably doesn't know himself," I said, "which is actually useful information. Ask him to come back. Tell him I want to talk, not negotiate. There's a difference." Another long look around the table. Then the Prime Speaker gestured to an aide near the door, who stepped out. While we waited, I looked at the 3 Dreth military attachés. They were watching me with the careful stillness of trained military observers, who were doing their very best not to let anything show, which meant they were showing quite a lot, just not to anyone who was not paying close attention. They were frightened, not of me specifically, of what I represented, of the ship outside on the docking arm, and everything that ship meant to the files they had read in their strategic briefings. "I want to say something before the High Marshal arrives," I said to the room at large. "Something that I think might help us get through the next few hours more efficiently." No one objected. "I am not here to threaten anyone," I said. "I am not here to make demands on behalf of a fleet that doesn't exist. I am not a compact officer in any official capacity, and I want to be extremely clear about that, because I think the ambiguity on that point is going to create problems if we let it sit. I am a former salvage professional who found a ship and read some records. What I found in those records was useful information about how the people who built that ship handled situations very much like this one. I would like to share that information with you. That is what I am offering. Information and perspective, and, if it is useful, my time." The Prime Speaker looked at me steadily. "And in return?" "In return, nothing," I said. "There is no return. I am not trading. I bought the ship for 400 credits, and inside the ship was everything the Compact left behind, and the most important thing they left behind was a record of how they managed to keep their piece of the galaxy from ending more than once. Sharing that seems like the right thing to do. Eleanor Voss would have agreed." The Prime Speaker's expression shifted very slightly. "You know the Admiral's name." "She wrote me a letter," I said. "A very long one, 500 years ago. She knew someone would eventually come and read it, and she wrote it for that person. She was remarkably good at anticipating situations." The door at the far side of the chamber opened. The Dreth High Marshal came back to the table. He was a large individual, by Dreth standards, with the broad frame and the gray armor integration that indicated long senior military service. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent his life making every action look intentional. He looked at me from across the table, and I looked back at him, and neither of us said anything for a moment. Then he sat down. He picked up his chair, positioned it precisely, and sat down, and the act of returning to the table was its own kind of statement. He had made a decision. He was not going to explain it. "High Marshal," I said, "thank you." He looked at me. "You are very small," he said, which my translator delivered in a flat, factual tone that suggested it was an observation rather than a criticism. "I am," I agreed. "The humans who built the Black Zenith were considerably larger, on average. I am something of a departure from the historical standard." The smallest possible thing that might have been a smile moved the corner of his face and disappeared. "What do you want?" he asked. 30 days, I said. "A ceasefire, 30 days, and then this conversation continues with everyone at the table, and no one planning an engagement while we talk. After 30 days, if we have made no progress, you are no worse off than you are now. If we have made progress, then we have saved an amount of life that I don't know how to estimate, but suspect is very large. And if we refuse?" I thought about Eleanor Voss. I thought about her notes on what the Compact had done in situations like this. I thought about the specific phrasing she used in the 3rd case study, when the parties involved had pushed back on the ceasefire request. "Then I sit here," I said. "I have nowhere pressing to be. The Black Zenith is very comfortable, and Ozymandias keeps good company. I will be here when you are ready. That might be tomorrow. That might be in 6 months. I am patient. My people were historically very patient. It was one of the things that made the other civilizations nervous, if you want the truth of it. Not the weapons, not the technology, the patience. A silence that lasted long enough to be meaningful. The Dreth High Marshal looked at the Veilcore Prime Speaker. The Prime Speaker looked at the Marshal. Something passed between them in that look. Not an agreement exactly, but a recognition. The acknowledgement that they were both looking at a situation they had not anticipated, and that the unanticipated situation had a specific shape that both of them understood. 30 days, the High Marshal said. The Prime Speaker nodded. 30 days. I looked at both of them. Good. Let's talk about what you actually need, because I think that conversation is going to be more useful than the one you've been having. Outside the speaking ground, on the docking arm of the outer ring, the black Zenith sat dark and patient. On the dome display of its empty command bay, the stars turned slowly, and the power levels held steady at 79% and climbing. Ozymandias was listening. It always listened. And somewhere in the sealed lower section of the archive room, in a storage unit that had not yet been opened, a final record waited. The record of what the compact had built, at its height, that it had chosen to put away. The record of what it had been capable of, and what it had declined to do. Not yet. There would be a time for that record, but not yet. For now, there was a table with 12 seats, and 9 people, and 1 former junk hunter, and 30 days, and the oldest and most reliable tool that Eleanor Voss had left behind in her strategic notes. The truth, told plainly, to people who needed to hear it. The ceasefire held for the first 9 days without difficulty, which I had not entirely expected. Military truces have a way of developing unexpected complications as soon as the parties involved get some distance from the room where the agreement was made, and remember all the reasons they had for being angry before they agreed to stop. I had anticipated pressure by day 5 and active problems by day 7. But 9 days passed, and both the Veilcore and Dreth commands observed the terms, which said something about what the previous 12 days of failed negotiation had cost both sides. They were tired. Tired people honor ceasefires more reliably than energized ones, because the energy required to break a ceasefire is the same energy that tiredness takes from you. I spent those 9 days at the table. Every day, several hours, with rotating groups of delegates from both sides. I did not try to rush anything. I followed Eleanor Voss's method exactly as she had described it, which was to ask questions and then listen completely to the answers without offering solutions, until the shape of what each party genuinely needed became clear enough to work with. The border dispute, as presented publicly and in the official conclave session records, was about a system called the Keth Array, a cluster of 3 inhabited planets and 1 significant mining installation that sat at the precise intersection of Veilcore and Dreth territorial limits, in a zone that both sides had been claiming for 40 years without resolution. The legal arguments were genuinely complex and genuinely unresolvable by legal means, which was why they had been sitting at this intersection unresolved for 40 years. But the Keth Array was not what this was actually about. It took me 4 days of listening to understand what it was actually about, then another 2 days to confirm it from different angles, in different conversations, because Eleanor Voss was very clear in her notes that your first identification of the genuine need is often partially right and partially a projection of your own assumptions, and you need to check it. The Dreth Empire was in a period of internal political instability that its High Marshal was not able to discuss openly. 3 of its 7 primary systems had experienced significant economic contraction over the past decade, and the political response to that contraction, at the domestic level, was pressure on the military command to demonstrate strength, to produce a victory, to give the population something to feel confident about. A genuine military engagement with the Veilcore Confederacy would serve that domestic political function, win or lose, because the act of fighting was itself a statement of capability that reassured an anxious population. The Veilcore Confederacy, for its part, was dealing with a different problem. A new generation of Veilcore political leadership had come to power over the past 15 years that had significantly less experience with military conflict than its predecessors, and was therefore much more willing to contemplate it, in the way that people who have not experienced a thing tend to underestimate its costs. The Confederacy's military command was, privately, deeply uncomfortable with the current political pressure toward engagement. But military commands do not override political direction in the Veil Corps system any more than they do in most functioning democracies. And so the military was heading toward an engagement they privately did not want, because the political leadership had convinced itself it was necessary. Two parties heading toward a war that neither the Dreth military nor the Veil Corps military actually wanted. The solution was not complicated in principle. It required giving the Dreth something that served the domestic political function that war was supposed to serve, without actually being a war. And it required giving the Veil Corps political leadership a way to resolve the situation that looked like strength rather than retreat. Eleanor Voss's notes had a case study that was almost identical. She called it the substitution problem. The question was never how to stop two parties from fighting. The question was what you could offer that would do the same political or social work that the fighting was supposed to do. On day 11, I sat across from the Dreth High Marshal alone, with just the two of us, and a translator present, and I told him what I thought was happening, and asked him whether I was correct. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You are a junk hunter." I was, I said. Now I'm apparently something else. How do you know this? Because Eleanor Voss figured out the same pattern 500 years ago, and she wrote about it clearly enough that I could recognize it when I saw it. She was very good at seeing the real problem underneath the stated one. He was quiet for a moment. If you know this, the Veil Corps know this. They don't, I said. Or rather, their military does. Their political leadership doesn't. That's part of the problem. He looked at me with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something in between. The expression of someone who has been carrying a thing alone for a long time and has just discovered, unexpectedly, that someone else knows the weight of it. "What are you proposing?" he said. I told him. It took the rest of that day and most of the following morning to work through the details. What I proposed was not a territorial solution to the Keth Array question, because there was no good territorial solution. What I proposed was a joint development administration for the Keth Array, governed jointly by both powers with rotating administrative authority, which produced revenue that both sides shared and which gave both sides something they could point to as a gain rather than a concession. I also proposed a set of bilateral agreements on economic exchange that would, if implemented, address the root causes of the Dreth economic contraction more effectively than a military engagement would, though that was the part that would take years to negotiate fully. And I proposed something else, something smaller, and in some ways more important. I proposed that the Black Zenith's archive be made partially accessible, on a shared basis, to both the Veil Corps and Dreth leadership, not the full archive, not the military records or the strategic documents, but the Compact's record of economic and social policy from its 140 years of growth, the successful approaches, the things that had worked, and the reasons they had worked, documented by people who had actually implemented them. 500 years of accumulated applied knowledge, available to anyone who was willing to sit down and read it. The High Marshal looked at this proposal for a long time. "You would give this freely?" he said. "The Compact left it for the galaxy," I said. "That was always the point. They didn't leave it only for humans. They left it for anyone who needed it. You need it. So does the Confederacy." On day 13, I presented the framework to the full conclave table, the High Marshal and the Prime Speaker present. I had discussed it in advance with both of them separately. I had confirmed that both of them, privately, were willing to support it. Presenting it jointly meant that neither side was seen to be accepting terms proposed by the other, which was crucial for domestic political optics on both sides. They were accepting a framework proposed by a third party that was neither of them, which was a different thing entirely. The delegates argued about details for 4 more days. That was expected. Eleanor Voss had predicted it. She called it the second-tier problem, where the principle gets agreed upon by the principals, and then the teams of supporting delegates spend days arguing about specifics, because that is what supporting delegates do, and you simply have to let the process run, while staying close enough to catch it, if it starts to unravel. On day 18, a preliminary agreement was signed. Not a final resolution, a framework for continued negotiation, a joint administration structure for the Keth Array, a commitment to bilateral economic talks, and a formal acknowledgement by both sides that the Compact Archive, through the Black Zenith's custodian, would be made available as a reference resource for future negotiations. No war. 18 days. I called Ozymandias from the conclave chamber that evening, sitting alone at the big round table with the overhead lights dimmed, the delegates gone for the night. It held, I said. It did, the ship said. Eleanor Voss's third case study resolved in 22 days. You were faster. She had more preparation. You had less preconception, Ozymandias said. She went in knowing exactly what she was. You went in knowing nothing, which meant you asked better questions. I sat with that for a moment. You were watching the whole time. Always, the ship said. I have always watched. For 340 years I watched for a human hand on my entry panel. I had extensive time to practice watching. Does it feel different? I asked. Now that you're awake again. A pause that lasted long enough to be something more than a processing delay. Yes, Ozymandias said. It feels like something that was waiting has finished waiting. Which is, for something that has been waiting a very long time, an unusual sensation. I thought about going back to the Black Zenith that night, and sleeping in one of the oversized officers' bunks that I had gotten reasonably used to in 3 weeks. I thought about the archive room, with its walls full of amber glowing records, and the terminal still showing Eleanor Voss's message on its screen. I thought about what came next. Ozymandias, I said. What is the state of the lower sections? The ones that are still sealed. 2 remain sealed, the ship said. 1 will open when you return to the vessel. The other requires a direct compact officer authorization that cannot be provided by palm contact alone. It requires a spoken command in the compact's operational language. Can you teach me that language? I have been teaching you since the first day, the ship said. You already know more than you realize. You have been understanding my speech directly for 9 days. Not through translation. I stopped. I played back the last 9 days of conversation in my mind, and I realized, with a start that I should probably have had much earlier, that Ozymandias was right. Somewhere in the first 3 days of being aboard the ship, the fragments of understanding had connected, and deepened, and become something I was no longer consciously aware of processing. I had been receiving the ship's speech directly, in a language I could not have spoken 2 weeks ago, and I had not noticed the transition because it had been gradual enough that it felt like something that had always been true. How is that possible? I said. The compact's operational language was designed to be relearnable, Ozymandias said. Eleanor Voss anticipated that any human who came to the ship would have lost the language. She built the ship's systems to provide a structured relearning environment that was subtle enough not to feel like instruction. You were taught while you slept, primarily, through the environmental audio system, low frequency, below conscious perception, a method the compact used for efficient knowledge transfer over long periods. I stared at nothing for a moment. You taught me a language while I was sleeping. Over approximately 18 days of gradual exposure, yes, without telling me. Eleanor Voss's notes specified that if you were told, you would try to learn it consciously, which would be slower and less effective. The subconscious method requires lack of awareness to function correctly. I thought about this. I should probably be more bothered by that than I am. Most people report that reaction, according to the compact's records. The compact did this regularly? It was their standard onboarding method for new officers, Ozymandias said. It was considered considerate rather than intrusive. You learn what you need to function, without the friction of deliberate study. I exhaled slowly. All right. And the command for the last sealed section? Say it, the ship said. You know it. You have known it for 4 days. You simply have not used it because you have not needed to. I thought about the fragments that had been settling in my mind for days. One of them was a phrase, a specific phrase that had the feel of a formal command, the weight of something that opened things, rather than simply described them. I had registered it as a linguistic artifact and set it aside, the way you set aside things you don't quite have context for yet. I said it. The Veilcore station around me, the neutral corridor outside the chamber, none of it responded, because the command was not for anything here. But 9 light hours away, on Cathara Station, in Bay 97, the last sealed door on the 4th level of the Black Zenith opened. And Ozymandias, monitoring the ship's systems remotely as it always did, relayed the contents of that room to my comm unit in a simple text message. I read the message. I read it again. I put my comm unit in my pocket and sat alone in the empty conclave chamber for a very long time, looking at the table. The last sealed room was not an archive. It was not a weapons bay or an engineering section. It was a single room containing a single object, a complete, fully operational secondary command system, a shipbuilding facility in miniature, capable, according to the specifications Ozymandias had transmitted, of producing one vessel from available materials in the surrounding region of space. Not the Black Zenith, not a copy of the Black Zenith. A new design, a smaller design. A vessel built not for a flagship role but for an individual, for an officer who needed a ship appropriate to one person rather than a full crew. Eleanor Voss had not left just the flagship. She had left a way to build something new. She had left the means for whoever came to the ship to say, "I am not rebuilding what was. I am starting what comes next." I sat in the empty room and breathed. Outside the speaking ground, in the wider sector, a ceasefire was holding. An archive was being prepared for shared access. Two civilizations that had been moving toward war were, tentatively, moving toward something else. Inside my pocket, my comm unit held a message that described a room and a facility and a possibility that I had not been looking for and had not expected to find. I thought about 12 credits and a broken visor and a flask of synth whiskey. I thought about a ship that nobody would bid on. I thought about a letter from a woman dead for 500 years who had known, somehow, that someone would come. I put my hand flat on the table surface, which was not a ship, and did not respond, and I thought, simply, all right, Eleanor. Let's see what comes next. The comm from Earth's Interstellar Affairs Bureau arrived 6 months after the ceasefire agreement was signed. I was in the archive room of the Black Zenith, which had become something of a permanent workspace by this point, with my personal gear arranged around the reading terminal and a second portable screen set up beside it so I could run references alongside primary documents. I had been working through the Compact's record of their early diplomatic methodology, the approach they used in their first decade of contact with galactic civilizations, because I had 3 more situations on my current list that I needed to understand better before I could be useful in them. The Cathay Joint Administration was functioning. There had been 2 significant disputes in the 6 months since the framework was signed, both of which had been resolved by the Joint Administrative Board without external intervention. The bilateral economic talks were ongoing, slow, and genuinely productive, in a way that slow talks often are, when the parties involved have accepted that they are actually trying to reach an agreement, rather than simply appear to be trying. 2 other situations had reached my desk since then. A territorial negotiation on the far side of Veilcore space, involving a small collective of independent systems that had no formal representation at any major power council, and a trade dispute between a Yehesi scientific organization and a Dreth commercial consortium that had been producing escalating hostility for 3 years, and was starting to show signs of moving towards something more serious. I was learning, slowly and with considerable difficulty, the difference between situations that could be improved by attention and situations that required the passage of time. Eleanor Voss had written about this at length. She had called it the most important discipline in the field, knowing which kind of situation you were in. I was not, by any honest assessment, a diplomat. I was a former salvage officer with 12 credits and a ship, who had found an archive full of information produced by people who actually were diplomats, and who was trying to be useful with what I had. The distinction mattered. I was not pretending to be Eleanor Voss. I was trying to do what she would have recognized as the spirit of the thing, even if I lacked her training and her certainty. The Bureau's message arrived on my personal comm, with a priority flag that suggested someone at the other end had pushed every escalation button available to them simultaneously. I read it. It was, in diplomatic language, an order, not phrased as an order, because Earth's Interstellar Affairs Bureau was technically not in a position to give me orders, but structured as an order, in the way that strongly worded official correspondence always is. It directed me to cease all activities being conducted in the name of the Ardent Compact, to surrender the Black Zenith to Earth government custody at the nearest Earth-affiliated installation within 60 days, to provide a complete inventory of the ship's contents for official assessment, and to desist from any further diplomatic engagement with galactic powers on behalf of any entity not currently recognized under Earth's current interstellar governance framework. There was, at the bottom of the message, a brief paragraph about cooperation being in my best interest, which was the kind of language that is used when the person writing the message is not entirely sure they have the standing to make demands and wants to cover the possibility that they do not. I read the message. I put my comm unit on the terminal desk. I looked at the walls of the archive room. Then I called Ozymandias. "I assume you have read it," I said. "The message from the Earth Bureau," the ship said. "Yes." "Can they make me comply?" "No," Ozymandias said, with a directness that I appreciated. "The Black Zenith operates under the Compact's charter. The Compact's charter was never dissolved, and was never superseded, because doing so would have required the formal acknowledgement of the Compact's existence by the powers that preferred to act as though it had never existed. No galactic power, including Earth's current government, has any formal standing to claim the Black Zenith, because doing so requires acknowledging the history they buried. Earth's Interstellar Affairs Bureau has no legal mechanism to compel compliance without invoking that history. Invoking it would create more problems for them than letting the situation stand. I nodded slowly. They want the archive. Almost certainly, Ozymandias said. The archive represents an extraordinary resource. Knowledge, technology, diplomatic methodology, accumulated over a century and a half. For any government, controlling that resource would represent a significant advantage. Eleanor Voss didn't leave it for one government, I said. No, Ozymandias agreed. She left it for the galaxy. Her specifications were clear. The archive was to be made available to any party who would benefit from it, with specific conditions attached to access that prevented any single power from claiming exclusive control. And you would enforce those conditions? I would enforce them, the ship said, in the way that a ship enforces things, by existing, by being what I am. No single party has the capability to compel the Black Zenith to comply with instructions contrary to its custodian's direction. The Bureau knows this, which is why the message is phrased as a request, dressed as an order, rather than an actual directive with teeth. I picked up my comm unit and reread the message. They're going to be persistent, I said. Yes. And the political pressure back home is going to be significant. Once this gets beyond the Bureau and into broader public awareness, which it will, the conversation about what the Compact was, and what happened to it, and what its legacy should be, is going to be difficult. There are people who are going to have strong feelings about this. Also yes, Ozymandias said. Eleanor Voss anticipated this as well. It is addressed in the 37th section of her strategic notes. I found the 37th section. I had read it before, but not in this context. Eleanor Voss wrote, "The hardest negotiation will not be with the powers that are afraid of what we were. The hardest negotiation will be with the humans who come after us, who will have grown up without the knowledge of what we chose and why, and who will have very human reactions to discovering that their history was deliberately concealed from them. Some will be proud, some will be angry, many will be both. The best approach is honesty. Tell them what we did, tell them why, trust them with the whole truth, including the parts that are not comfortable. Humans, in our experience, handle the truth better than they handle its absence. We have always been like that. It is one of the things I have valued most about us." I put the terminal down. I drafted a response to the Bureau, not a refusal, a response. I told them, clearly and in plain language, what the Black Zenith was, what the archive contained, and what Eleanor Voss had specified regarding its use. I told them that I would provide full access to a designated Earth government representative who agreed to the Compact's access conditions, which I would be happy to share. I told them that the ship was not available for transfer to any single government's custody, because the Compact's charter specified that the Black Zenith was to remain under the custodianship of its designated officer, and not under any sovereign authority, a condition that existed for reasons that the charter explained at length. I told them that I was happy to discuss all of this further, in person or in writing, at their convenience. I sent it. Then I went back to Eleanor Voss's notes on early diplomatic methodology and continued reading. 3 hours later, Ozymandias said, "There is an incoming call. Not from the Bureau this time." "Who?" "A journalist," the ship said. human, based on a station in the Valcor border territories. She has been researching the ceasefire agreement for 3 months and has traced the involvement of the Black Zenith back to Cathara Station. She wants to speak with you. I thought about this. Eleanor Voss's notes say anything about journalists? Section 42, Ozymandias said. She recommends speaking to them honestly and without attempting to manage what they will do with the information. She argues that the story of the compact is one that the galaxy needs to hear, and that attempting to control the telling of it will produce a worse result than allowing it to be told imperfectly by people who are simply doing their job. Was she right? She was right about most things. I accepted the call. The journalist's name was Kate Farley. She was young, maybe 25, with sharp eyes, and the specific kind of focused patience that good journalists develop, the ability to wait without looking like they are waiting. She introduced herself professionally, stated the publication she worked for, confirmed that she was recording with my consent, and then asked me, very directly, what the Black Zenith was. I told her. I told her everything. The auction, the 400 credits, the archive room, Eleanor Voss's letter. I told her what the compact had been, and what they had chosen, and why. I told her about the conclave, and the ceasefire, and the joint administration that was now, 6 months in, functioning. I told her about the Bureau's message, and my response. She listened without interrupting. She was very good at that. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you think people are going to believe this?" "Some will, and some won't," I said. "That's generally how it goes. What do you want them to take from it?" I thought about that. "I want them to know that the compact existed," I said, "that humans built something extraordinary, and that at the moment when that extraordinary thing was going to cost the rest of the galaxy enormously, they chose to step back. Not because they were weak, not because they were forced to, because they calculated the full cost of what winning would look like, and they found it unacceptable.
And I want them to know that the people who made that choice thought about it very carefully and were not ashamed of it. They were proud of it."
Eleanor Voss was proud of it. She wrote a letter to the future that made that clear. Kate Farley looked at me steadily. "And you? Are you proud of it?" I sat in the archive room with the amber glow of the storage units on every wall, and I thought about that question honestly. "I didn't do it," I said. "It's not mine to be proud of, but I understand why they were, and I think they were right. And I think the fact that a civilization at that level of capability chose the harder, quieter path over the easy, devastating one says something worth knowing about what humans are. At our best." She nodded, wrote something, looked up. "One more question." "Go ahead. What do you do now?" I looked at the walls of the archive. I thought about the room at the bottom of the ship, with the facility that could build something new. I thought about the 3 situations on my current list, and the 37th section of Eleanor Voss's strategic notes, and the slow, patient work of sitting in rooms where important things were being decided, and asking the questions that nobody else had thought to ask. "I have a list," I said, "and a ship, and more reading to do." She smiled slightly. "That sounds like a plan." "It's something," I agreed. Eleanor Voss would probably have called it a start. The interview ran 3 days later, on a publication that was distributed across 47 star systems in 5 languages. The response was significant in the ways I had expected, and surprising in some ways I had not. There were people who were angry about the concealment. There were people who were proud of the compact's choice. There were people who disputed the historical record entirely, which was also expected. There were academic historians who had been chasing fragments of the compact's story for decades, and who contacted me within hours of publication with the specific kind of barely contained professional excitement that people who have been searching for something for a long time experience when they find it. And there were humans, ordinary humans from Earth and from colonies and from installations across known space, who sent messages through every channel they could find, most of which reached me eventually through Cathara Station's forwarding address because I had not yet set up a formal contact system, which I clearly needed to do. The messages were different from each other in every way that messages from a variety of people could be different. But a large number of them shared one thing. They said, in different words and with different emotional textures, the same thing. They said, "I always wondered if we had done something worth knowing about. And now I know." I read as many of them as I could. Then I went back to work. The black Zenith moved slowly through the outer belt of the Keth Array system, 3 light minutes from the nearest inhabited planet, running quiet. Ozymandias preferred this approach to new situations. Arrive slow, make no sudden moves, let the environment register that you are present, before announcing yourself formally. Eleanor Voss had called it the honest entry. You show yourself before you speak. People who announce first and show second often have something to hide in the gap between the two. The Keth Array was, 6 months after the framework agreement, visibly different from the crisis zone it had been during the conclave session. The joint administrative installation in orbit around the second planet was operational. 3 cargo convoys were moving through the system, which meant commerce, which meant the economic justification for fighting over it had been replaced by the more practical interest of profiting from it. People who are making money have reasons to prefer stability. I was not here for the array. I was here because the Joint Administration had flagged a complication in its first operational report, a social tension between the populations of the first and third planets that had been invisible in the high-level territorial negotiations, and was now, with the framework in place, visible enough to need attention, not a military problem. A community problem, the kind of thing that, left unaddressed, becomes a justification for the next round of political pressure. Eleanor Voss's notes had a name for this, the secondary layer. The visible conflict gets resolved, and the resolution reveals what was underneath it, and the underneath thing needs its own attention. She had an entire section on how to approach community-level tensions that were downstream of political decisions, and reading it had made me feel genuinely inadequate because the work required was detailed and patient in ways that suited someone with an entire diplomatic corps, not someone with a ship and a reading terminal. But Ozymandias had pointed me toward a section of the archive that I had not yet worked through, records not of methodology but of personnel. The compact had maintained, at its height, a structured community affairs division. The records of how that division worked, who had staffed it, what they had done, were in the archive, complete, usable. I had been thinking, for the past month, about the facility in the lower sealed room. Not about building a ship, about what building something represented. Eleanor Voss had not left a facility for building a larger presence. She had left a facility for building what came next, whatever that was. And what came next, based on everything I had read and everything I had seen in the past 6 months, was not a fleet, and not a government, and not any structure that looked like the compact rebuilt. What came next was something smaller and more durable, a network of people who knew how to do this work, who had access to the archive, who understood the methodology and were willing to apply it, system by system, situation by situation, without the backing of a military force or a formal political authority, but with the backing of something that had proven, in 6 months of working practice, to be surprisingly effective. The truth, told plainly, and the patience to keep telling it. I had been corresponding, through Kate Farley's publication, and through the contact system I had eventually set up, with a number of people who had read her interview and reached out. Several of them were academics. Several were retired diplomatic staff from various galactic powers. 3 were human, from different parts of the settled human population. 1 was Veilcor, a junior administrator in the Confederacy's Foreign Affairs Office, who had read the archive excerpts I had made publicly available and written me a very long and very thoughtful message about what she had found in them. I had been thinking about what a community affairs division would look like if it was rebuilt from scratch by a single person, with limited resources, an extensive archive, and a ship that would open its doors to the right people. Ozymandias, when I had raised this idea 3 weeks ago, had said, Eleanor Voss's notes anticipate this in Section 61. Section 61 was titled, in the archaic English of the original, On the Question of Continuance. It addressed exactly the question of how the compact's work could continue if the compact itself was gone, which Eleanor Voss had apparently understood might eventually be relevant. She wrote, the work does not require the institution. It requires the knowledge, the will, and the willingness to remain in the room longer than the other parties want to remain in it. These are things that can be taught and learned and passed on without the structure of a government behind them. What I would tell whoever reads this is, do not try to rebuild what we were. You do not have the resources and the galaxy has changed. Build what is needed now, with what you have, and trust that it will be enough. We were always a species that built with what we had, and it was always enough, eventually, if we kept at it. I had read Section 61 many times. It was not, by any measure, a complete blueprint. It was the note of someone who had done a great deal, and was trying to pass on the most essential part of what she had learned, in a form that would survive the loss of everything else. It was enough. The black Zenith completed its slow arc through the Keth-Array outer belt, and oriented toward the joint administrative installation. Ozymandias sent a polite notification to the installation's traffic management that we were approaching. The response came back in under a minute. Welcomed, Docking Bay 3. The administrator would like to meet if I had time. I had time. I had the patience, according to Eleanor Voss, of a species that had been doing this since before it had a name for what it was doing. Ozymandias moved us toward the installation, and I went back to the reading terminal for 20 more minutes while we traveled, because there was always more to read, and I was nowhere near finished. The facility in the lower sealed room had its operational manual in the archive. I had read it twice. It was technically clear and practically specific. Building with available materials meant the first vessel would be simple, a small ship, fast and long range, built for 1 or 2 people, capable of reaching any point in the sector in a reasonable time. A ship for someone who needed to be somewhere and had work to do when they got there. I had 3 names in mind for candidates to crew it, once it was built. 1 academic, 1 retired Vale Corps administrator who had spent 30 years in field diplomacy and was, she said in her most recent message, entirely too young to retire in practice even if the paperwork said otherwise. And 1 human, a young man named Owen Clark who was currently working in logistics on a colonial installation in the Outer Territories, and who had written me a message that was either the most earnest thing I had read in years, or the most carefully constructed impression of earnestness, and either way had demonstrated a quality of thinking that I found genuinely promising. 3 people, 1 small ship, a large archive, a galaxy that was, underneath its memory of the compact, not so different from the one Eleanor Voss had navigated 500 years ago. The installation grew closer on the dome display, its running lights steady and welcoming in the dark. I thought about 400 credits and a junk auction. I thought about how the most important things tend to be the ones that nobody else wanted to bid on. I put down the terminal and went to the command chair, which I still sat on the edge of because it was still too tall for me, and watched us dock. Ozymandias, I said. Yes, the ship said. Start the fabrication specs for the new vessel. We'll need materials. Begin an inventory of what's available in the region. Already started, Ozymandias said. I began preliminary materials assessment 2 weeks ago, when you first read Section 61. I looked at the dome above me, the full exterior view of the Keth-Array system, 3 inhabited planets, and 1 mining installation, and a joint administrative platform, none of which were at war today. You have been very patient with me, I said. You are doing it correctly, the ship said, given what you had to work with when you started. What did I have to work with when I started? A flask, Ozymandias said, and the particular human tendency to walk toward things that everyone else walks away from. And 400 credits. And 400 credits, the ship agreed. Eleanor Voss would have said that was more than enough. She would have been right. The docking clamp engaged with a solid, satisfying click. Outside, the Keth-Array system continued its ordinary business. Commerce and administration, and the small, daily work of people trying to live well in a complicated place. No war today. Tomorrow was its own question, as it always was, and I would be here for it, reading and listening and asking questions and sitting in rooms longer than people expected, with the patience of someone who had learned it from the notes of a woman dead for 5 centuries, who had trusted that eventually someone would come. Someone had come. I gathered what I needed, stood up from the edge of the oversized chair, and went to meet the administrator. The black Zenith sat quiet on the docking clamp, dark and patient, and below in the sealed facility that was not sealed any longer, the fabrication systems ran their first operational check and found everything ready. I bought a ghost ship for 400 credits at a junk auction at the edge of nowhere. Turns out I did not buy a ship. I inherited a reputation. I inherited a letter from Eleanor Voss and an archive and a name, and the very particular burden of being the only human in the room in a galaxy that had spent 500 years trying to forget what humans were capable of. And out here, in a sector that remembered even when it claimed to have forgotten, that was, it turned out, worth everything.